women in their militaries. And so we were a novelty, which increased our risk, not only from being in a war zone, but increased our risk just within the camp itself. So we had rules to live by that others did not. And one of them was we were always armed. Like every soldier in the camp was always armed. Everyone carried their weapon with them, and you slept with your weapon right next to you. You know, that was a given in a war zone. But for the women, we had additional rules, which meant we could not walk alone. We went nowhere alone. You must have an escort, whether it was another woman, one of the soldiers, but you had to be escorted. And the preference was either a Canadian or a US citizen, because they understood North Americans, right? Many of the gents were very, very confused. And then once they started to understand that we were the nurses, things changed in our tour. Because then there was a wide berth given to us, and there was always greeting of us. The leers and the jeers stopped, because then they figured out that it was me whose face they would be looking at if they got injured. Right? So why alienate your helpers, right? So that was the NATO camp, and so part of just the rules of being on a tour is that it's a dry camp. So there is no alcohol, and you don't want anyone with alcohol and everyone being armed. That's a recipe for disaster. But there were certain occasions where we got to have some alcohol, and it was a beer, right? And they would give us 2 beers, and I'm not a beer drinker, so they were like this big, right? Very large beers from my perspective. So we each could have 2. Well, the medical folks, still, we did not want to drink them, and we might take a few sips of one of our beers because we were always on duty, waiting for mass casualties. So we had buddies who would help us with our beer problem. And oftentimes they would steal them off to maybe one of the Afghan interpreters or someone that was off duty, and they would get to enjoy that as well, right? So, and then the other thing, and we only had those beers on special occasions. So for me it was Easter, which was foreign for me to drink beer on Easter, but you know, that's another thing. And then Canada Day, because I was there for Canada Day as well. My tour went from January of 07 to, it was supposed to end in June, but they delayed us and deferred us into the middle of August. So I had a 7.5, 8-month tour. So I got to see a lot of the seasons in Afghanistan, which is really, really cool. So how our days went is that we worked 7 days a week, and we got a half a day off a week for people maybe wanted to go to church, or just a half a day where you didn't have to be on guard. That all changed that there was a mass cal. You can forget that. There's no half day off. I chose to use my half day providing services, and I'll explain a little bit later, as a nurse practitioner, because there was not enough medical folk for the demand of all that we needed to do. The food, well now, food is very important to a soldier, very, very important to a soldier. And so we were very fortunate in that we had great food of all kinds and varieties. So we could actually have our fruit and veggies. A little wilty, but that's okay. They were veggies, right? Mm-hmm. So we got to have some really, really wonderful food, and we got to have, our camp was the North American mess hall. Everyone wanted to come to our mess hall because, we had really cool food, right? All different kinds of it. We wanted to go badly to the British and the Dutch mess halls, because they had fantastic food. And curry night happened once a week in the British mess hall. It was on Mondays, and we were all like making sure we had a good British friend so that we'd go to the mess hall and get an invite, right? Because the only way you could go to that mess hall is if you were invited by the soldier of that mess hall. So then we also tried for the Dutch one too, which is much harder to get into rather than the British. Although we all succeeded at some point being a nurse. We got there, right? We figured it out. Sleep, I just wanted to let you know, was often an interrupted event. And so during the nights, and if you worked nights during the days, we were always 100% on call for mass casualties. So whenever that happened, all hands on deck, everyone's moving, everyone's going in and doing the work. There was no one who could skip out of that. Rockets would get us up for a couple hours every night because we'd have to put on our bomb gear, run to the shelter, wait until the camp was cleared of rockets, because some didn't always explode, so we had to wait. And then undress and get back into bed, and then you're up again to go to work, right? And then also missing home and missing families. Some of the soldiers really, really struggled during the nighttime. And then the other was the dreams, right? Because your mind processes things as you sleep. Your unconscious mind helps to bring things to the forward for you to help consider and ponder. And so many, many people struggled with the dreams. But that happens. That's part of the situation. So what I was in was the Role 3 hospital. And so the Role 3 hospital was the trauma unit, the trauma hospital for all care in the Canadian contribution. So, and we worked very, very closely with the United States. And so the Canadians were the ones who provided that first initial trauma hospital care. And then the Americans, the British, the French, the Dutch, all contributed medical personnel to us. And then we also had civilians from Canada, our fantastic specialists of all kinds of physicians coming into the camp providing specialist services in a combat environment. So we were bringing in civilians to provide some of that high specialty care that you would see in a trauma level center in Canada. So this was the mix. And so we had specialists from all over the world too, because they figured out that they could come too. And so all of the specialists would put up their hands to come and do a tour. Their tour would be like 6 weeks, 12 weeks, and that would be the max. And so we were constantly rotating specialists of different kinds and different countries as we were delivering mass casualty care and high-level care and ICU and OR care. So it was a really, really challenging and super, super fun environment, because it was, as a nurse, that was just the cat's meow to get to do all this stuff, right? But I digress. So the Role 3 hospital was it. In Afghanistan, there was no other facility in the entire country with our capability. But that didn't mean you got to come to our facility. So there were rules, and it was soldiers first, right? Obviously, we were there to treat our soldiers. But being a compassionate country, as well as, you know, rules of war, you want to treat the Afghans, the people who were injured, the innocent civilians. And so we would have many civilians flow through our facility. And at some point there were more civilians than soldiers, which begged the question as to, do we have to change rules? Do we have to create different protocols? Because the bottom line is that the resources were finite. The resources were for our soldiers who were injured, right? They were not meant for Afghans. And so if we used the resources on an Afghan civilian, that meant a soldier would not get care. And it happened on our tours. So that brought a whole new different level of looking at what we were doing and how we could do things very, very efficiently, but still provide that care. And our approach was get more supplies, guys. Like, that's kind of simple. We're not going to turn away our civilians. But, you know, the upper leadership had to make some really, really hard decisions, which we had to follow, but that's the war environment. So in our facility, we had the trauma rooms, of which we had 8 bays that were developed, that we built and were identical. So that in a mass casualty situation, you would walk into a trauma bay and know exactly where everything was. So no time lost in someone's care. The other thing is that we had an operating room. We had 3 operating rooms, which were staffed by OR nurses and surgeons. And then we also had an ICU, staffed by ICU physicians and ICU nurses. And then we had a medical surgical ward staffed by general duty nurses or nurses that were not ICU trained. So there was all different kinds of levels of training within that facility. My role was the senior nurse. So I was in charge of the hospital as far as all of the nursing care delivered within that facility. So all 4 areas were my business, right? What I had to do and what we looked after. And so I had a large team of nurses and physicians, and we had a group of medics. So medics are non-registered folk, and we trained them in the Canadian Forces as frontline people out in the field. If you all remember, you know, MASH, right? So, and they used to love to call me Major Houlihan, right? It was hilarious. They were just, that was the only way that they could sort out what my role was. If I said, they would say, oh yeah, she's our Major Houlihan, they go, got it. But I wasn't like that, like I wasn't, but anyway, so what we would do is that we would always be meeting and trying to figure out. So when a mass casualty come in, and a mass casualty was greater than 3 critically injured people, our mass casualties, we were on the ground for 24 hours and we had our first mass casualty of 20, which got our feet wet, worked out all the bugs very, very quickly. So we had mass casualties minimum 3 to 4 a week, and that would be our minimum. And the role was, what we would do was bring them in to the trauma bays and where the trauma teams would be waiting. So it'd be a physician, a nurse, and a medic. That was our trauma team. And our specialists were outside waiting to be called into each bay as I ran around. My job was to run all the trauma bays and make sure that everything was available for that trauma bay and that they had everything that they needed in the exact moment that they needed it. So making sure all that was happening. And then when they were done with the trauma and they kind of had a sense of what we were doing for this person, it was OR, ICU, or the medical surgical ward, or the morgue. So we had the ways where everyone was going to go. So it was a very, very fluid environment. If they went from trauma bay to OR, straight to ICU, straight to surgical, and to the ward. So it was a regular flow of people. But our goal was not to keep them. Once we got them stabilized, out they went. They went out to Germany to Landstuhl, right? For all of our soldiers, right? And so we had to be very fast. Get them as stable as possible, as fast as possible, get them out because the mass cal was coming in, right? So you could never have all your beds full. And when all your beds were full, which happened to us a number of times because we had too many mass cals in a row, too close together, they'd have to wait, or we'd have to find somewhere that the medics could look after them in the field till we could get them in. Or we would take over some of the admin people's offices and make them makeshift rooms. And so we did that a number of times. So one fellow learned to live out of a briefcase because we kept taking his office from him, right? You need that, sorry, you're out. And so, and that's a time when we could just make the command decisions and kick people out of their offices. Didn't matter who it was. We could do that because that was the priority. So that's the kind of context. So I have to tell you about the mountains. So when I woke up every morning and walked to the camp, through the camp to our hospital, I looked at those mountains. And so I couldn't help when every Saturday, marketplace is marketplace, right? Everyone, opportunity, the entrepreneurs within Afghanistan would bring their wares in. And I walked by this particular painting, 4 or 5 weeks in a row. And I just kept grabbing my eye. And it was just those mountains, because when we came in January, the mountains were brown, and when we left, they were green. They were beautiful, majestic mountains. The other part about the mountains that, for me, were very, very particular is that wherever I've been in my life and where life has been super hard or super unfamiliar or challenged me to my core, God has placed me in mountains. So I decided that this had to come back with me. So, and my other thing is wherever I went within the military and all of the different countries and everywhere I would go, I would always try to pick up a local artist's original work. And so hence it's an original. And so, but he was very, very sweet, and he just was, you really like this, when are you gonna buy it? I says, well, I don't know, not today, maybe tomorrow. And I would come back each week, and then finally it was like, okay, it's mine. He says, I know, I've been saving it for you. So he was a wonderful, wonderful painter. So lessons. So what I've done is I wanted to do lessons for 3 different areas for you. So one is in nursing. The second area would be in relationships. And the third, most importantly, is spirituality and what that looks like in war. Okay, so for nursing, so I went to Afghanistan as a lead senior nurse, but I was also a nurse practitioner and a practicing active nurse practitioner. And at the time, the Canadian Forces were busy trying to show how a nurse practitioner could be a Canadian Forces member. and how nurse practitioners could work within the Canadian Forces Medical Services system. So I was also tasked at that time to do a research project on how we would do and what we could do. So we did that research project. But what we did was we actually, as a nurse practitioner and as a nurse, Afghanistan and Kandahar and being in the Role 3 was, you're at the very top of your game, and breaking through the glass ceilings is what we did as nurses and nurse practitioners, because none of it had really been done before. No one had, no nursing officers in our previous had done the kind of work at the kind of level and the kind of skill that we did as nurses in Afghanistan. And then we added on nurse practitioners, and a colleague and mine were the first nurse practitioners in Kandahar, so we set the bar high, we set it very high, because you had to work like the physicians. And if you couldn't do that, nurse practitioners were not to be, right? So what we did is we really worked hard with all of our nursing skills, and our nursing brought us through a whole lot of difficult situations, and our learning and knowing how to be compassionate, how to protect yourself from really, really hard scenes. All of that came into play as a nurse, right? And as a nurse practitioner. So our nursing was at the very, very top of our game. We were, I think we were outstanding. My team was an amazing, amazing group of people. And we had the medics with us. And so as we were doing this nursing at very, very high levels, we were training medics to be nurses and to do our job and step in. So we had them in the wards, and we had them in ICU, and we had them in OR. And a whole lot of those medics were very, very interested and understood our role much better to support us within the Canadian Forces, but also decided nursing was a really, really great career. So we converted a few medics into nurses. So we worked as a team. We worked 24 hours. The nurses were working 12-hour shifts. My role was to ensure that we had staffing for all those shifts, and then surge staffing for mass cows, right? Because when the patients were sick, and in ICU, you couldn't pull that nurse to do a mass cal, because that was an ICU patient who needed 24-hour care. So we always had to have surge nursing. So we would pull in from all over the world, like to get our staff to do the work. So it was a really, really challenging role. One thing that you notice or you find out when you're deployed, because nurses are nurses, but we're also officers, so we must lead at the same time as we're nursing, right? And so you had to do your leadership role as well as your nursing role. And so what we found is that you really understand who you are, and you really understand your skill sets, and you really understand your needs to learn and your weaknesses and what you need to build on as a nurse. And we were a very, very supportive group. My role, I made a very conscious decision as a senior nurse that we were not going to eat each other, and we were not going to be harsh to each other, because no one knew everything, and none of us had been in this situation previously. So kindness, compassion, and care for your fellow nurse and medic and doctor was priority number one, outside of caring for our patients. So in our team, we were always teaching. So every one of us was teaching. So some nurses would come in with such incredible skills, and then we put them on a ward environment and they were 100% lost. So the medics would teach them what to do, because we'd already taught the medics what to do, and they're very good teachers, right? So what we had done was really, really make a very, very tight, very, very efficient team, right? So, and what we found out within nursing is that, the nurses were the heart of the hospital. Without us, those fancy docs and those wonderfully skilled physicians could not meet their mission, which was to save the patient. So nurses were really, really key, but we didn't let that go to our head, because, you need to be humble. You need to understand that what you're doing is a gift. And so you don't need to be all stuck up about it, right? So I was very, very, and that area, I think the Major Houlihan part came out, because anytime I saw any of that attitude coming forward, it was immediately dealt with, because I just didn't want our team to get lost in the wonder of it all, shall I say. So the other part about nursing was that we always were learning, and we learned from all of the different nurses in NATO. So we had British nurses, American nurses, Canadian, Dutch, French, and we're all rotating through. And so we were all learning different nursing ways from different countries and different cultures. So that was a really, really fun, encouraging, rejuvenating kind of environment when you're learning that much. So on to relationships. So there were multiple relationships within a war environment that, frankly, I just wasn't thinking about until afterwards, and the reflection of time is wonderful. So we also had relationships with our fellow soldiers. So soldiers being any soldier, any Canadian Forces member, right? They were our fellow soldiers, whether they were medical or not. And it was that connectivity, that being very, very connected, all working hard for one purpose, and it was for the Afghan people. We were working very hard to give them their freedom back. And so very, very driven. And so everyone had that similar, singular goal. And when you deal in a war environment with your fellow soldiers, you create relationships, whether or not they're medical or in other groups, but they're your friends for life. I'm still in contact with people I served with in Kandahar, and they're your friends for life because there's that particular bond, particular understanding, and you don't have to explain yourself to them. You can say a word and they know what you're talking about. They know the situation that you're talking about. They know you don't have to talk too much. You just can say a few words and you're connected all over again, right? And that closeness is back. So that was one big relationship that was very, very key. The others that I hadn't expected was with the Afghans themselves and in different areas. So Afghan interpreters, you've heard a lot about them in the news lately about what's happened with Afghanistan and the interpreters needing to get out of Afghanistan and come to safe harbors. So they were, the nurses were the sort of heart of your unit. The interpreters were the facilitators. Without them, nothing happened. So to give you an understanding, oftentimes we would have civilians come in with a mass casualty because the Taliban would have blown them up, right? So we would get literally families that were riding in a cart blown up, and so you'd have the entire family coming in a mass cap. And when an Afghan would come into our location, into our hospital, it was an extremely frightening experience for them because remember, they had no hospitals. They didn't have anything like what we had. The side of the road care kind of stuff, right? And so when they would come into this, MASH kind of tent and bells and whistles and people and armed people with guns, they were absolutely terrified. And so it was very, very difficult to try and help a critically injured Afghanistan person when they were so terrified of you because all they knew was soldier was a bad thing. And we're all just the soldiers, right? We're armed, we're wearing our weapons all the time, 24 hours a day. So we had to help get them to understand that we were there to care for them, we were there to help them. And the way that was done was through the Afghan interpreters. So every bay had one interpreter per 2 trauma bays. So we had 3 to 4 interpreters who worked with us 24 hours a day, and they would do shifts. And so there was about 21, 22 of them on my tour that were coming in and helping. And they would be at the patient's head, whispering what we were telling them, whispering what was going on, encouraging them to calm down. Let the nurse put the IV in, let the nurse care for your wounds, let the nurse check your heart, right? All of that sort of stuff so that they could be treated. And so the interpreters were a relationship for me that, one, I was not expecting, and 2, thank you, Lord, right? Oh my goodness, because they were Christian men. All interpreters were men, women were not permitted outside of the homes, right, at that time, because safety for one, but the men were doing all the interpreting. And so we had them providing all of this wonderful care, and we would be working around the interpreters, but we didn't want to forget about them in the care, because they were civilians seeing horrific things. And so we were always caring for them, checking in on them, making sure that they were okay, and could you perform this particular interpretation or not? If you couldn't, it's okay, we're gonna get by, we're gonna figure it out and we'll get by. But so we had this group of interpreters who we absolutely loved. And to leave them was so difficult. And then to hear about what's happened to them was extremely difficult to hear. But one of my favorite interpreters who I really, really connected with is in Canada. Some of the nurses got together and brought him to Canada, so I was pretty relieved about that. But they were truly amazing men, and they taught us so much. And just, I'll tell you more about it in the spirituality area, but amazing, amazing people. The other one was the connection with the patients. So your soldiers, so you had one way of dealing with your soldiers, because if you gave them too much love and too much tenderness and too much care, you put them outside of the headspace of you're in a war zone and you need to be a soldier all the way through, right? And so you wanted to keep up their strength and their morale, so you always looked after them, but you always had soldiers visiting, right? So their units and their leaders and comrades were always coming and visiting their soldiers. But we loved to give them as much care and spoiling as we possibly could, but then we were also being like this by their commanders, saying, don't do that to my soldier, you gotta be more stoic with them. And we're like, guy's kind of really injured here, like kind of needs a lot more care. And they gave us a hard time about not being too soft on them, because then that would not help them returning to the battlefield. So we're like, okay. One thing I did not anticipate, but we learned to do it. Kindly. But we did have to learn to do that. So one of the other things with the relationships, not just the patients, so the patients, the Afghan patients, the one who stayed with us for months and months, and we did have one fellow who stayed for months because we could not get him stable enough to send out. He was so critically injured. But there were many, many patients who came through our doors, and we absolutely fell in love with the people. They are just tremendously, wonderfully warm, caring, stoic, lovely, lovely people. And we had a hard time with some of the patients, because when the kids came in, we had a lot of children who were injured, and I'll talk about that. But they would be, there was one little guy, he was so incredibly cute that he stole every single soldier's heart. Like any one of us that he met, he had us wrapped around his baby finger, like boom, right? And so then he was gonna go home. He'd been with us for a number of weeks, and he had been alone, right? So oftentimes the children would come in minus parents, minus siblings, so all by themselves. And so that care of a child had to come forward as well as the care of an injured civilian, right? And so we would have lots and lots of soldiers who would volunteer their half day to come and visit with a lonely child, or a very, very critically injured child who needed someone to just hold the hand. And so we had a lineup, we actually had a roster. And so it was all the volunteer dads and moms and soldiers who wanted to help with the children. There was one little guy in particular that he was about, I think he was 18 months old, and he was really badly injured in a bomb. And he was healing very, very well, but he just wouldn't stop crying. 24 hours a day, that child cried and cried and cried. And it didn't matter what we did, he cried and he cried and he cried. And as a mom, I'd had enough. So I got myself a swaddling cloth, and I put him on my chest and wrapped him with me, and I worked the entire day with him attached to me. And he didn't cry once. And so we went, this little one needs physical contact. So then we needed a roster for those willing to swaddle the baby and work. Had that roster going too. But what was great was that as soon as we started to do that with him, he healed. He just got better, boom, 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 and away he went home to his family. So that, for us, it was like, oh gosh, no one taught us that we had to do pediatric care like that. They're like, okay. But so we kept learning. Every day was always an opportunity to learn. The other relationship I wanted to tell you about was the nurse practitioner and the chief nurse of Afghanistan. So in Kandahar, we were like, the newest show in town, so we always had visitors, governor generals, high generals, royalty. We had lots and lots of folks visiting us. But the one person who stood out to me was the chief nurse of Afghanistan. And so she came in to visit, and of course, being the senior nurse, I was tasked to be her companion, take her around, show her everything, and talk. And we got into this amazing 1-hour conversation about nursing in Afghanistan. And what was really fun about that is that everyone else waited for her to finish speaking with me, and no one dared interrupt her, which I went, oh, okay, like, wow. She had some real influence and respect within her community. So we talked and talked and talked about nursing in Afghanistan, and she gave us a whole lot of feedback on how to nurse her country and her people, which was invaluable to us because that was shared without all of the nurses. But the other thing was that she was a nurse practitioner trained in the United States and came back to her home country to care for the patients and care for her country and lead her country. And it was just an amazing opportunity to see a nurse leader and trailblazer like right in front of me. So that was one of the best relationships I had. She was very, very interesting. Now, spirituality, because that's a big one. So there were so many lessons as a Christian woman to go into Afghanistan. I just decided to pick a few because I could talk for hours, as you can see. So the big one, and this is where the interpreters were absolutely key, and they trained us first mass count because there were so many mass counts. We got trained really, really fast. But day one, they helped us understand that when an Afghan person dies, whether it's a Afghan National Guard, any Afghan who dies, you must face them east. Must. Didn't matter where you were in the trauma bay, what you were doing, when that death occurred, you must face them east. And we're all going, what the? Guys, we're way too busy to be doing all this kind of stuff, They got a lot of pushback from us. But they were very persistent. And then so one of the days when they came, so what are you doing this for? They says, well, it's Allah. You got to face them to east. That's where they're going. And we're like, got it now. We weren't thinking a lot about our Christianity and our spirituality because we were in a war zone. We were there to care for people. We were very focused. And sometimes with your mass cows, this had to be your focus, right? And so we learned very quickly. And then we also learned that we had to do some body care when a person died. Other than facing east, there was a body care. So then we decided, all right, who is going to be tasked if there's an Afghan who dies in our facility, who's doing that care? Because we don't have time to do the requirements that needed to be done in the middle of a mass count. So then we found people who understood the Afghan, and oftentimes it would be an interpreter who was free. So what was good was that they were amazingly marvelous men who really were so flexible and could really teach us with respect and kindness, right? And that only garnered that respect and kindness back towards them. And so I had there was my favorite interpreter, I had a great conversation about God with him, because I really did want to understand what we were doing and why we were doing it. And he would say, well, you have God, I have Allah, it's the same person. And I went, how's that? So we started talking about Easter time, because we were there at Easter time. We talked about all the way through Jesus' teaching and stuff like that. They had very much parallel things. And so I was like, oh, so very, very similar. It's just we're saying things a little differently, practices are a little differently, beliefs are a little bit different, but the same undercurrent of belief in their Allah and in God. So for me, that was a very big learning time for me in my spirituality. There was another thing that I learned within the spirituality part was when there was the death. So there was always a sense of great loss. We did not do that well as a group who were bent on saving every single life, and we had a record of no deaths in our facility. And so when the first 2 or 3 actually did, like no deaths of a soldier, okay, that I gotta clarify that. We would have our Afghans sometimes die because they weren't as fit and healthy as us, but no death of a soldier. So when that did happen, there was something that was very hard for our community to lose a single soldier, right? And so there was a lot of that sereneness and that sadness surrounding, and no one knew or were comfortable was what should we say in these moments? Like, what do we do when we lose a soldier? And I'm like going, well, I pray. Like, do we want to have a prayer? So then we sought out the Padres to be present at every single Mass Cal. Should someone go, that we're praying for that person, because that was super important. And a lot of people were of Christian faith or of different faiths, but they all needed a prayer. And so we got the Padres involved, which was great, because then we could really we could pause for, a very, very short line or two and move on, right? But that became very, very important to us as the war got much, much worse, and we would lose one or two people. It was very difficult. And then that prayer also transitioned to our Afghan people. And so they also got prayers according to Islam. So then we found a Padre who knew the Afghan ways for prayer on death. All right, he's got to be present now, right? So we just kept adding and adding to our church community and to our Christian community and to the spiritual community to meet everyone's spiritual needs, which was a lot of fun. And so for me, my spirituality changed significantly in Afghanistan. And so, one, God placed me in the mountains, so I knew he was protecting me. I knew he was there. The other thing was that you would see so many things that we weren't prepared for. And you would see what humans could do to one another. You could see the very, very worst of people. And in brilliant, brilliant moments, you would see the very best of people. And it was getting that balance between the people who were really out to harm and those who were out to comfort, to console, to heal, to care, and to love, and show that love forward that Jesus always taught us about. And loving in those situations can be super hard, because we would also be treating enemy soldiers, knowing that they had blown up our soldiers, knowing that they had blown up Afghans, women, children, seniors. And we would have to provide that same level of care to the enemy soldier, which was extremely difficult. And the only way you get through that is through your faith. And that was the only way I got through that, having to care for the enemy soldiers, was that one, it's God's child. Two, he's placed him here for a reason. And three, I must do my duty. And so that is how we all got through, at least I got through the enemy soldiers, and how many of us who cared for the enemy soldiers managed. We did have times where we would have medical folk refusing care. Sadly, they're not allowed to confuse according to the Geneva Conventions, right? You cannot refuse care. So we'd have to help them understand and get them their heads to a different space to understand that this is your job regardless. It's not, you don't choose. This is your job, right? So learning how to do that in hard times and difficult circumstances. And that was a very big spiritual growth for me, because I really suffered knowing that the person I was providing life-saving care to just killed so many people. But that's not my choice. God will deal with what God will deal with, right? So I had to let that go and go for God. So how did so one of the big things I did was I very quickly learned that in a war zone, you must protect, you must guard your mind and soul. You must. You must have strategies in place. You must develop things to protect yourself so that your compassion stays, because that was a big one for us to lose very quickly, and I'll tell you a story about that in a moment. But how did I guard my mind and soul? Talking to the Padres. We would have church services on Sundays, but you couldn't often go to them because most of the time, Sunday was a work day for the Afghan army, and for the Taliban, it was a work day. And so we were busy doing NASCARs on Sundays. So sometimes we got to see church, but most often not. But talking to the Padres was a really, really big thing for us and for me. The other thing I did was really watching my diet, really making sure I was eating healthy food, so I was resilient, making sure I was well hydrated, getting as much rest as I could, and I would run. I would run every day for 1 hour, listening to Matt Redman's Beautiful News CD. So that's a big Christian CD that I had, and I would run the entire length of that CD, and there was no stopping the run until I'd heard every word in that music. And I did it every single day. And that's what gave me strength and power to go forward and to move on. And it kept me really fit. But my head was also fit, and that was absolutely key, is to have your head fit as well as your body. So for me, that's what I did. The other thing I learned, one of the other big lessons was that compassion is a choice. And when one of the things that happened in our tour was that very, very soon, you got really familiar and accustomed to seeing people minus a lot of their limbs, or critically injured with chest and abdominal and head wounds and head injuries. And very, very soon, because we were good and we were saving everyone and no one was dying in our tour, in our watch, you could lose your compassion. And you could just see, not the person, but the body minus whatever. The body injured in whatever way. And there was one particular instance that just drove it home to me, in that we had, some Afghans, some people blown up, and they were bringing a bunch of people in, but we were only getting 2 or 3. So for us, that wasn't really a mass count. That was just, some people coming in, right? Not a big deal. And that was the first clue that I went, we're not worried about 3 critically injured people. Yeah, we have room for all kinds, but we're not worried about 3 critically injured. And then one fellow came in with 1 limb missing. He was put on the low priority because he only had 1 limb missing. Like, who cares? Like, just 1 limb, like, no big deal. And then it dawned on me, but it's a big deal to that person who's just lost their limb. And so and I was noticing all of us had this little bit of a mindset, and I went, oh, okay, fixing this one right away. And so I went around to every single person, and I did a briefing after the mass count about our compassion. And that is, when you see someone who's injured, don't forget, this is the worst day of their life. And you need to care for them, and you need to be compassionate, and you need to demonstrate that compassion as you're caring for them. And so what was really cool was that all of a sudden, once we started recognizing that we were getting way too familiar and way too comfortable with massively critically injured people, that we were losing all of our sense of compassion, then it was, okay, compassion force, right? All right, who's the watchdog? So whenever we would see, so all of us, I put it as, all of us needed to be the watchdog of our compassion and of our colleagues' compassion. So whenever we would see a medical person losing that compassion, losing that care, we would have a conversation with that person in private. Guess what? This is what we noticed. And remember, this person needs you to care. Absolutely needs it. And so that was the one big thing I learned, that compassion was not always available, and then you needed to do something about it, right? Let's see, so I told you about that already. So the last thing I wanted to tell you, and I'm sure you must all know, but any soldier who's gone to a war environment comes home with scars. All of us have scars. And it's related to the experiences, it's related to the situations, it's related to the environment, it's related to a lot of things. But we all come home with wounds, and we all will carry them forever. What the thing is that what you do with that information is up to each and every person. And some people need to get a lot of medical care, and that's really important to do. Some people need to go to church more often. Some people need to pray to God more often, which is what I did, and help me get through some of my wounds and some of my scars, because there is a lot when you're I went in as a very sort of naive as far as war was concerned. We all were naive as far as war, but also very, very Christian focused, and had my faith tested, like to the max, in many, many situations. And for me, it was like, okay, you either look after yourself and put your faith 100% full step into God, or you try and figure it out on your own. And I thought it was a whole lot easier to put my faith in God and do something with God and do my healing with Him than try and tough it out and figure it out, 30 years down the road. So for me, we all learned what we were made of. We all learned our strengths, we all learned our weaknesses, we all learned to lean and care for one another. And we just were lucky to have had the group that I was with. Like, for me, it was just the best group. And I'm still in contact with them, and we're still looking after one another. So then the last thing I wanted to comment on, because it's one of those things in the room, is what do you think about the Taliban's return? Well, my first reaction was dismay, because we worked really hard to give the women and the vulnerable in the Afghanistan communities their voices and their ability to contribute to their communities. We worked very, very hard on that. The interpreters were amazing, and so we were very worried about them. I had a lot of anger because we worked so hard, 20 years. How many Canadians did we lose? Well over 150. And so many Afghans lost their lives, and the Taliban came in within a week. And that just dismayed me. Like, I was furious, absolutely furious. I had a few comments with the Lord helping me to come to terms with that, right? But then I felt so sad for the people because they lost so much. They had got back their democratic society, and then it was removed again, challenging them more, right? And so I pray for them all the time, just because they need our prayers to just come through this again and find their way. The other thing was that their loss of education. So now we had this wonderful generation of young men and women with a great education. We had 2 generations, and now their children may not have it. So how do they manage that? Like, how do they get them to the level that they're at? And then I worry about the society, right? That people being pushed down again. But as you must know, the Afghan people are incredibly stoic, resourceful, determined, persistent, consistent. And I'm sure, I believe that they will find a way. They will return. It's just maybe not in our lifetime. I don't know. But I just have this sense and this belief that they will be back. They will not let the Taliban put them down repeatedly. And that's all I have to say.
Is this woman not a blessing in our midst? Cheryl regularly comes to Aprons and Briefcases. It's a group that Mimi and I run, and it's open to any women in the parish. It's a spirituality time. So I already knew so much about this woman's heart and faith, but she has some pretty impressive credentials, and she is a very humble and modest servant of God. And I am sure you touched many, many people. And yes, all of us shared that anger, and I think God has big shoulders, so it's okay. And let's pray for the people of Afghanistan. So does anybody have a question for Cheryl, or should we call it a day? It's 10 after 1, but I know she could go on forever and we'd all remain riveted. Yes, Penny and Cindy. Okay, would you stay and take the questions?
When you were only allowed male interpreters, how did they cope with the women? Because they're not, I understood you weren't supposed to see another woman, only your own wife and family.
So we put the interpreters, thank you, I forgot to mention that. So yes, so when we had a woman come in who was injured, and we had many, many women come, the men were not permitted in the room. So only female providers. Unless, of course, they were critically injured and we only had one, thoracic surgeon. Well, I mean, he's going to have to come in, right? But so what we did was we put up a sheet, and the interpreters stood behind the sheet, right? So they couldn't see anything. But what we did is that we brought the stretcher right up to the curtain, and the interpreter right behind the curtain, so that he could hear what she was saying, and he could reassure her that he was not seeing her, and that and just get the information back and forth, because we really, really needed. The girls were terrified, absolutely terrified in our facility, and so we had to really, really calm them and help them out. But so then what we did was that we would just, all the care would be delivered by females, and we got barriers to protect their bed spaces as well, so that no man walking by could possibly see them. And we wouldn't have been able to do that without the interpreters. They're the ones who schooled us on how to care for their women, right? Which was amazing, right? But yeah, that's what we did. And so a lot of them, like, and we would say, you know, really, he can't see you, there's a curtain there, really, like, look. And so if they could turn and look and see there's a curtain, then they would just calm right down, right? Just, because then we had, there was women there, but it was a male voice, but the man wasn't there. Yeah.
First of all, I want to say thank you very much. You're very inspiring as a Christian, as a female, as a human being, and the world does not have enough of you. That's definitely.
Thank you.
But I did want to also ask, because you were talking about the different nationalities and all of the nurses trying to get together and learn from each other and that, and I imagine that there must have been a lot of challenges with the different languages, not only the different practices and everything else, but even just the different languages, let alone the Taliban, but you know, and as well as that, like that must have been a lot to combat as well.
Well, everyone going in had to have some level of English.
Oh, well, that's
So we would work with whatever English they had. But you know, to be honest, when you're in a really, really high stress environment, you revert to your first tongue, right? So sometimes they'd be speaking away and we'd be like going, English, please. We can't quite understand. But then there was a few of them that were busy teaching us their languages and we were teaching them ours. So we had a lot of fun and started learning a whole lot of new nursing language in different languages, right? So that was a lot of fun. But yeah, but the other thing is that we all had different ways of nursing. And so we had to have a standard of nursing and help them see that we all have to sort of meet this basic standard. And then we're gonna right? So that's how we did it. But it was always a lot of fun, right? We just, like, yeah, it was a really hard environment and we did a lot of horrible things, but there was also a lot of laughter, right? Because, you know, you get a bunch of nurses together, we gotta find the funny part in somewhere of it, right? There's gotta be a joke coming forward, at least one, right? So we did a lot of learning and a lot of laughing and a lot of caring. And then when the big stuff was happening, you know, you're busy doing your job.
Thank you very much.
Anything else? Okay, wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.